The night smelled of wet stone and burnt tobacco, the air heavy with secrets that never slept, and the hum of the city never stopped even when it pretended to be quiet. The restaurant at the corner of Via d'Arco glowed faintly under the rain, its windows steamed from heat and breath inside. Laughter collided with piano notes, and the soft clink of cutlery, while in one corner a man watched everything without looking at anything. His name was Dominic Vale, and his silence was a kind of authority. She moved between tables the way a blade moves through silk. Her name was Eva Costa, and she had no time for stories about men like him. The rain had ruined her hair, the tips of her shoes were wet, and her patience was thin, but her smile remained the same, the one you wear to survive in a world that doesn't notice you unless you serve it. She balanced 2 glasses of wine on a tray and walked toward the table that everyone avoided. Dominic looked up the moment before she arrived. His eyes were the color of stormwater, and just as restless. She set the glasses down and said quietly, "Anything else for you, sir?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back and studied her face as if it were a riddle someone had once written for him. She didn't flinch, she didn't lower her gaze. The manager watched from the bar, nervous sweat on his neck, whispering, "Don't talk too long, don't look too long." But Eva never liked orders from men who whispered. A bottle shattered in the kitchen, sudden, sharp, the kind of sound that cuts through conversations. Every head turned except Dominic's. He kept his eyes on her, his voice smooth and low. "Are you always this brave or just foolish tonight?" She replied without thinking. "Depends who's asking." He smiled, slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. She turned to leave, but his hand brushed the edge of her sleeve and stopped her. He said, "Tell your boss the wine is wrong, the vintage, the taste, the intent." She frowned, said, "I serve what I'm told to serve." He said, "Then you serve a lie." She looked at the bottle, the label perfect, but something about the scent, the faint sweetness under the oak, made her pause. She remembered her grandfather who used to make wine in the hills. He taught her that real red should never smell like flowers. Her heart skipped. She set the glass down and said quietly, "If it's wrong, why drink it?" He said, "Because someone wants me to." She stared at him, the truth behind his words colder than the rain outside. He picked up the glass, raised it halfway, then stopped and said, "What would you do if you were me?" She said, "I'd trust the waitress, not the bottle." And before she could think, she slapped the glass from his hand. It shattered on the marble floor, the liquid dark as blood spreading between their shoes. Silence held the room, then broke all at once. Chairs scraped, voices shouted. The manager gasped her name. Dominic rose, slow, calm, the way danger breathes when it's patient. He looked at the stain on the floor and then at the men 2 tables away, the ones pretending not to watch. He said softly, "She's right," and in that instant 3 guns appeared from under jackets and the music died. Chaos without noise. Dominic moved faster than she thought possible. One motion, a table flipped, another man down. The kitchen door burst open, and the smell of gunpowder joined the smell of wine. She ducked behind the counter, her hands shaking. The bartender screamed and ran. Dominic shouted something in Italian and the room became a storm of motion. When it ended, the rain sounded louder than before. Bodies still breathing, but not by much. Dominic stood untouched, his shirt torn, his calm unbroken. He looked at Eva and said, "You just saved my life." She said, "You're welcome." He said, "You also ruined my dinner." Sirens echoed in the distance. He walked toward her, reached into his coat and dropped something on the counter, a folded napkin, and inside it a key with an address. She said, "What's this?" He said, "An apology for dragging you into a war you didn't start and a warning to leave before the police arrive." She said, "Who are you?" He said, "The reason the police will never find me." He walked into the rain, his coat swallowing him whole, the street swallowing his footsteps. She stood there surrounded by broken glass and questions she didn't want answers to. When the police came, she told them she didn't see anything, and they believed her because she sounded tired. That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of shattering glass kept replaying in her head, and the look in his eyes just before the fight, not fear, not anger, something else, something like recognition, as if he had been waiting for someone to stop him for a long time. She took the napkin, unfolded it again, the key cold against her palm. She turned it over and saw a number written in ink, 9:30 by morning. She had convinced herself not to go by evening. She was already outside the address, an old warehouse by the docks. The sign above the door said closed, but the light inside said otherwise. She hesitated, the sea wind cutting through her jacket, and for a moment she thought about turning back, but then she remembered his voice, "You serve a lie." She pushed the door open, the smell of oil and salt thick in the air inside. The shadows moved like they belonged there. She stepped forward, her shoes echoing against the concrete. A single light hung from the ceiling, and beneath it a table, a bottle of untouched wine, and Dominic waiting. He said, "You shouldn't have come." She said, "I never listen well." He poured 2 glasses, the same kind as before, and slid one toward her. She didn't touch it. He said, "This one's clean." She said, "Prove it." He took a sip, smiled, said, "Better." He told her about the men from last night, how one of them worked for someone who wanted him gone. He said they thought the poison would be poetic. He said they underestimated poetry. She asked, "Why tell me any of this?" He said, "Because you're the only person in that room who didn't look away." She said, "That's not bravery, that's curiosity." He said, "Sometimes there." The same thing. Thunder rolled over the water, the lights flickered. She looked around the warehouse, saw crates marked with names. She didn't understand foreign letters, expensive secrets. He said, "Now that you're here, you can't pretend you don't know." She said, "Then maybe you shouldn't have invited me." He said I didn't. You invited yourself. She wanted to leave, but her feet stayed still. Something about him, about the quiet control, the exhaustion beneath it, made her want to understand him or destroy him. She couldn't tell which. He said, you still think I'm the villain? She said, I think you like pretending you are. He laughed, said, maybe that's safer. The rain outside turned heavier. It drummed against the roof like warning drums. He walked her to the door, handed her an envelope, and said, if you ever hear the name Luca Ferry, you run. She said, who's that? He said, the man who thinks I owe him everything. She asked, do you? He said, I owe him the chance to regret. She walked out into the storm, her jacket pulled tight around her, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold, and read the envelope still sealed in her hand. She looked back once the warehouse door already closed, the world behind it gone. She felt the weight of what she had stepped into, something larger, older, dangerous. She whispered to herself, fearless waitress, sure, and started walking, and somewhere behind her in the dark Dominic watched from the window, the ghost of a smile touching his face as if he already knew she wouldn't stop now. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the world still looked wet. The streets glistened under pale sunlight like glass veins pulsing with secrets. Eva walked to work pretending her life was still hers. The air smelled of coffee and diesel, the chatter of early traffic trying to drown out the thoughts in her head. She kept replaying his voice, if you ever hear the name Luca Ferry, you run. She whispered it under her breath, as if saying it might dull its edge. At the restaurant everything was quieter, the tables cleaner, the music softer. Her manager avoided her eyes. She saw men in plain suits watching from a parked car across the street and knew it wasn't police. The napkin and key were gone from her apron, but she could still feel the outline of where they had been. She poured coffee for strangers, smiled when she had to, and tried to keep her hands from shaking. By noon a man walked in, tall, thin, too polished for this part of town. He ordered espresso, sat at the bar, and folded his hands perfectly still. He looked at her the way a snake looks at a bird, then said in a smooth Italian accent, you must be the waitress who ruined a very expensive plan. She froze mid-step, the cup rattled against its saucer. He smiled, lazy, unhurried. Luca Ferry, he said, introducing himself like a man saying mass. He told her the wine she destroyed was meant for a celebration, and now the guest of honor had other problems. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, of course you don't, then leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Tell Dominic Vale he still owes me blood. Then he stood up, adjusted his cuffs, left a 50 on the counter, and walked out as if he had just discussed the weather. Her manager asked if she was okay. She said she needed air, stepped outside, and the city swallowed her heartbeat whole. She walked fast, her thoughts chasing her down every corner, Dominic's warning ringing clearer now. She wanted to ignore it, to go home, to pretend, but something deeper than fear pulled her back toward the docks. She found herself standing before the warehouse again before she even decided to go there. Inside it was empty, the table gone, the light off, dust rising in the air like ghosts, but on the floor she found a matchbox with the name Rosario Hotel stamped on it. She'd seen that name before, the place everyone whispered about, where deals were signed and lives unmade. She put the box in her pocket and left. The hotel stood near the river, its marble cracked, but its curtains still drawn thick and red. Inside the lobby smelled of perfume and secrets. The man at the desk didn't ask questions, he just said, room 9. When she didn't say anything, he said, Mr. Vale is waiting. She felt her pulse kick. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. He sat by the window, the skyline behind him carved out of haze, his jacket draped over the chair, his shirt sleeves rolled, eyes tired but steady. He said, you shouldn't have come. She said, Luca Ferry came to me. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair, the calm breaking for the first time. He said, what did he want? She said, you. And he said, of course. He told her Luca was once like a brother, until greed turned blood sour. He said, Ferry ran the ports, now owned the cops, fed on fear and loyalty, bought with promises. He said the attempt at the restaurant wasn't just a warning, it was a message to everyone watching that even Dominic Vale could bleed. She said, then why am I in it? He said, because you made me look mortal, and in our world that's reason enough to die. A storm rolled over the water, the wind pushed rain against the glass. He said, you can still walk away. She said, if I wanted to walk away I would have never come. He looked at her long and slow, said, fear and loyalty are twins. You know, one keeps you alive, the other makes you stay. She said, maybe I'm just stubborn. He said, maybe that's worse. A knock at the door cut through the air. He motioned for silence, pulled a small pistol from the drawer. 3 men entered before he could reach the handle, suits, cheap faces, unfamiliar, the kind of men hired for one job. They said, Mr. Vale, the boss sends his regards. Dominic shot first, the echo swallowing the rest. 2 fell, the third ran. The carpet turned red. Eva pressed herself against the wall, the smell of gunpowder thick as breath. He said, move now. They left through the service corridor, the hallway long and narrow, the fire alarm screaming overhead, the sprinklers burst, water mixing with smoke, the world turning white around them. Outside the sirens were already near. He shoved her into the car, slammed the door, and they were gone, tires screaming across wet asphalt. They didn't speak until they reached the bridge, lights flashing behind them, growing smaller. She said, this will never stop, will it? He said, not until one of us disappears. She said, which one? He said, I'm betting on me. He handed her another key, this time smaller, darker, said there's a place across the border in Geneva. If you ever need to vanish, she said. What about you? He said, if I live that long maybe I'll find out what peace looks like. The car slowed in an alley. He told her to wait. Came back minutes later, his coat darker from rain. He said, we can't go back to the hotel, they'll burn it to hide the mess. We'll go south to the estate outside Palermo. No one will look for me where I was born. She asked, and me? He said, you're under my protection. She said, that doesn't sound like freedom. He said, it's better than a funeral. They drove until dawn, the road curling along the sea, the first light cutting through clouds. She dozed off and woke to the sound of waves. The estate loomed ahead behind iron gates, vines climbing its walls. Like old secrets, the guards nodded as they passed. Dominic said, welcome to the last safe place in Italy. Inside, marble floors cold under her shoes, oil paintings staring down at her from the walls, a piano in the corner gathering dust. He said, you can rest here, no one will find you. She said, you keep saying that as if you believe it. He said, I have to. Days passed slower, the house surrounded by silence and soldiers. She walked the garden at dusk, watched him talk to men by the fountain. He gave orders softly, but they carried weight, the kind that made men move without asking why. She saw how they looked at him, not like a criminal but like a king whose throne was built on bones. She began to understand why everyone either feared him or followed him, sometimes both. One night she found him in the study staring at a photograph, two young men laughing on a fishing boat, Luca Ferry beside him smiling brighter than he ever had. She said, that was him, wasn't it? He nodded, said, the last day before everything changed. She said, you could end it by going to him. He said, no wars end cleanly, and besides, Ferry doesn't want peace. He wants memory erased. She said, what if memory refuses? He said, then it dies with us. The next morning a car arrived carrying letters, men whispering orders, a meeting set at the old opera house, neutral ground, or so they said. Dominic told her to stay. She said, I'm coming. He didn't argue, he knew better. As they drove through the city, the opera house rose like a relic from another age, its chandeliers still burning after all these years, the kind of place where tragedy belongs. The guards took their guns at the door, but not their intent. They walked into the grand hall, Ferry already there leaning against the stage steps, smiling like sin. He said, Dominic, Vale alive after all. I was beginning to lose faith. Dominic said, you never had faith. Ferry said, true, I only ever believed in outcomes. Dominic said, then let's finish it here. Ferry's smile widened, said, gladly. The meeting began with words, but ended with movement, guns hidden under roses, knives disguised as loyalty. Eva stood behind Dominic, heart drumming like a second clock. She saw one man raise a weapon too early. She shouted his name. Dominic turned, the bullet missed his heart but found his shoulder. Ferry vanished in the confusion, guards firing into smoke, chaos blooming under chandeliers. They escaped through the back corridors, the sound of sirens close again, the opera burning behind them, Eva half dragging him through the rain, his blood mixing with it. He said, still fearless. She said, still stubborn. He laughed, then winced. Said, next time you listen when I say stay. She said, next time you stay alive long enough to say it. They reached the car, the engine coughing to life, the road leading them away from fire and ruin. She looked back, saw the flames licking the sky. She whispered, this doesn't end, does it? He said, no, but at least now we know who we're fighting. And as the dawn broke over the horizon, the city behind them burning and the sea ahead whispering, they drove into whatever came next. Two shadows bound by choices neither could undo. The sun rose over Palermo like a tired promise, spilling gold across cracked rooftops and dust. The estate stood quiet behind its iron gates, birds circling above as if even they were afraid to land. Eva woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window, slow, deliberate, too measured to belong to a servant. She rose without thinking, her hand brushing the small knife Dominic had given her the night before for emergencies. He said, this world doesn't forgive the unarmed. She opened the shutters just enough to see Dominic walking across the courtyard, his shoulder still bandaged but his stride steady. He was speaking to two men, one she recognized, Vito, his most trusted soldier, the other a stranger, face thin, eyes sharp, the kind of man who studied everything before deciding if it deserved to exist. Dominic gestured toward the house, the stranger nodded, and they both looked up as if they knew she was watching. She stepped back, her heart remembering to race. Breakfast was served in the library, sunlight bleeding through tall windows. Dominic sat at the table waiting, paper spread before him, maps, letters, names. She sat across from him, the silence between them no longer awkward, just full. He said, they'll come again. Ferry doesn't forgive public humiliation. Eva said, then we should strike first. He smiled, the ghost of approval in his eyes. You sound like me. She said, maybe you taught me something. He said, maybe I ruined you. They spent the morning building lists, allies, debts, favors owed. Dominic wrote names like confessions. Some crossed out, some circled. She noticed one circled twice, Francesco Marino. She asked who that is. He said, the man Ferry trusts most, his right hand, his executioner. She said, so he's the one who pulls the trigger? He said, no, he's the one who decides when it's pulled. By noon the house filled with the smell of gun oil and salt, airmen checking weapons, polishing cars. Eva watched them move like clockwork, each knowing his place. Dominic stood at the balcony, smoking, his eyes tracing the sea. He said, I Never wanted this, you know, the empire, the fear. It was supposed to be order, but order built on fear always breaks, she said. Then why stay, he said. Because if I leave they'll tear apart everything I built and call it justice, she said. What about you? What do you want? He looked at her long enough for the silence to answer, then said, I want to remember what it felt like before I started counting enemies, she said. Maybe I can remind you, he said. Maybe you already did. That night they met with the families who still owed Dominic loyalty, the old guard, the men who remembered his father. The meeting took place in the underground hall of an abandoned theater, candlelight flickering against walls covered in dust, the smell of decay mixing with cigars. Dominic spoke like a man baptizing himself again. He said, Fairy's greed will drown us all. We stand or we disappear. One by one they murmured their assent, but Eva saw fear behind their nods. Loyalty, stretched thin by years of blood. When the meeting ended, Dominic told her quietly, there's a traitor among them, she said. Who? He said, that's what we'll find out tomorrow night. Fairy will make his move, then we'll see who turns. The next day the air was heavy, clouds crawling over the sea, the kind of sky that promised rain. Dominic's men patrolled the grounds, the sound of boots against stone echoing through corridors. Eva couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even inside the house she saw faces that weren't familiar, shadows that lingered too long in doorways. She asked Vito if he noticed. He said, always. By dusk the first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, the estate shrouded in gray. Eva stood at the window watching lightning split the sky. Dominic entered without sound, his presence filling the room. He said, Fairy's men are close. She said, how close? He said, close enough to smell the ocean. He handed her a small revolver, said, just in case. She looked at it, said, I thought I was under your protection. He said, you are, but sometimes even gods forget to answer prayers. The power went out once thunder rolled through the hills and the house fell into darkness. Candles flickered to life, shadows grew longer outside, engines idled unseen. The storm swallowed all sound until the first shot shattered it, men shouting over the rain, the echo of violence spreading through the estate. Dominic grabbed her hand, pulled her into the hallway. They ran through marble corridors lit by lightning flashes, the air thick with smoke, and shouting. Vito met them at the stair, his face cut, blood running down his temple. He said, they're inside. Dominic asked, how many? Vito said, too many. Eva saw fear in his eyes, not for himself but for the man he served. Dominic told him to guard the back door. Vito nodded, vanished into the chaos. Dominic led her toward the study where a hidden passage waited behind a bookshelf. She followed him, heart hammering, but before they reached it a figure stepped from the shadows, gun raised. It was Francesco Marino, rain dripping from his coat. His eyes calm. He said, Dominic, you made this too easy. Dominic said, I thought you'd come alone. He said, I did, but I brought ghosts with me. Eva lifted the gun. Dominic motioned for her to lower it. Marino smiled, said the waitress, brave again. But you should know you don't scare me. Dominic said, she doesn't have to, and before Marino could reply the thunder cracked and Vito appeared behind him, firing once, clean, precise. Marino fell, silence after storm. Dominic looked at Vito, nodded once, gratitude, wordless. They pulled Eva into the study, shut the door. The secret passage, narrow cold stone walls leading downward into the old tunnels that once connected the estate to the chapel near the cliffs. The air smelled of damp earth and old prayers. They walked fast, Dominic limping, his breath rough. She held his arm steady, neither spoke until they reached the end where a wooden door opened to the sea. The storm had broken, the rain easing into mist, waves crashing below the cliff, the world silver and black. Dominic leaned against the rock, his shirt soaked in blood. He said, Fairy won't stop now, he'll come himself next time. She said, then we'll be ready. He said, no we won't, but it doesn't matter. She said, why? He said, because for the first time I'm not afraid to lose. They found shelter in a fisherman's hut by the water, candles casting long trembling light across the walls. Dominic sat on the floor. She cleaned his wound, her hand steady despite the shaking inside. He said, you should have run when you had the chance. She said, I told you I don't listen well. He smiled faintly, said, you'd have made a good soldier. She said, maybe I already am. The night stretched endless, the storm whispering through cracks in the wood. She lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the sea answering it heartbeat for heartbeat. She realized then that what bound them wasn't fate or fear, it was choice, two broken souls choosing to stand in the fire rather than watch from safety. By morning the sky cleared, the sun climbing over the horizon, turning the sea to gold. Dominic stood at the doorway, his coat over his shoulders, the wind pulling at his hair. He said, Fairy will come here, he'll bring everyone he has. She said, then what? He said, then we finish it. She walked to him, the light spilling over both of them, said, if we die, we die standing. He said, no, we live standing. And for the first time since she met him she believed he meant it. The gulls circled overhead, the waves broke below, and somewhere beyond the horizon war waited, but for now there was only them, the sea, the quiet, and the promise of one last reckoning. The morning came with no mercy, the horizon bruised with the color of war, the sea restless beneath the pale sky, gulls crying like omens. Eva stood outside the fisherman's hut, her hair tangled in the wind, the salt biting her skin. She could smell smoke in the distance, not fire yet, but close. The sound of engines rolled through the valley, the sound of men who had already decided who would die today. She turned and saw Dominic standing in the doorway, his coat draped over his shoulders, his face carved by sleeplessness and resolve. He said, They're coming, she said. I know, he said. You can still leave. There's a path behind the cliffs. It will take you north, she said. If you finish this without me, you'll have to start it again without me. He stared at her long and slow, the kind of look that seals a fate. Then he said, then we stay together. The first truck appeared on the ridge, black against the sky. More followed, headlights cutting through the mist like knives. Dominic's men spread out through the rocks, silent, focused, Vito at his side, eyes steady, hand on his rifle. Eva stood between them, gun cold in her palm. She had never killed anyone, but fear was a stranger now. She only felt the pulse of something old, something that felt like belonging. The air broke open when the first shot came, a flash from the ridge, dirt exploding beside her, men shouting, the storm of bullets tearing the calm apart. Dominic fired back, voice carrying over the chaos, short commands in Italian, sharp as steel. Vito moved with deadly grace, dropping one man after another, the smell of gunpowder mixing with salt, the world turning into rhythm and thunder. Eva crouched behind a rock, the sound too close, too fast. She saw a shadow moving through the smoke, a man creeping toward Dominic. She didn't think, she just raised her gun, fired once. The man fell, his body twisting into the sand. Her breath came fast, her hands shook, but her aim had been true. Dominic turned, saw her, said, good girl, then ducked back to fire again. For hours or maybe minutes the fight blurred into one long scream, the trucks burning one by one, the sea catching fire from the fuel slicks, the sky dark with smoke. Luca Ferri's men pushed forward, ruthless, endless, the kind of soldiers who believed in nothing but orders and money. Dominic's men fell slow and steady like dominoes, but he held the line, every move calculated, every shot personal. When the smoke cleared, only echoes remained, Ferri's convoy in ruins, bodies scattered among the rocks, the sound of engines fading, then silence except for the sea. Dominic stood breathing hard, blood on his sleeve again. Vito slumped beside a broken wall, alive but barely. Eva dropped her gun, her ears ringing, her body trembling from exhaustion. She walked to Dominic, said, is it over? He said, not yet. A single car appeared on the road, its black paint glinting under the sun. Ferry stepped out alone, suit immaculate despite the dust, a man who believed the world owed him victory. He clapped slowly, his voice calm. So this is where kings go to die? Dominic said, no kings die in palaces, we die where we're born. Ferry laughed, said, poetic as always. He pulled a pistol from his coat, aimed it at Dominic, said, I gave you everything, you threw it away. For what? For her. Eva felt the world narrow to a single breath, Ferry's hand steady, his smile colder than the sea. Dominic stepped forward, said, she has nothing to do with this. Ferry said, she has everything to do with this. She made you weak, that's what love does. He raised the gun, fired once, the shot echoing off the cliffs. Dominic staggered but stayed standing. Ferry blinked, confused, looked down, saw the blood blooming from his own chest, Eva's hand still smoking from the gun she had picked up behind the rock. She walked to him, slow, deliberate, her face calm, her eyes empty. Ferry tried to speak, but the words drowned in blood. She said, you should have listened when he told you to stop, then fired again. Silence swallowed the coast. Ferry's body fell backward into the sea, the waves closing over him like the end of a confession. Dominic leaned against the rock, his hand pressed to his wound. Eva ran to him, caught him before he fell, his breath shallow. He said, you shouldn't have done that. She said, I couldn't let him take you. He smiled faintly, said, fearless to the end. She said, stubborn to the end. He laughed soft, then coughed, the sound wet with blood. She held him tighter, said, stay with me. He said, I will until you stop needing me. Vito called out from the distance, men gathering what was left, the fire dying, the sea beginning to calm. Eva pressed her forehead to Dominic's. He whispered something she almost didn't hear. Find the letters in my desk, they'll tell you who I really am. Then his hand slipped from hers. The days after passed like smoke. The estate burned to the ground to erase the war. The papers called it an accident, a fuel explosion at the docks. No names mentioned, no justice served. Eva buried him by the water under the same sky where they met. She read the letters he left behind, stories of men who wanted to build order out of chaos and became the chaos instead, secrets that could have destroyed nations. She burned them one by one until only ashes remained. Weeks later she sat in a cafe overlooking the harbor, wearing plain clothes, hair shorter, voice quieter. The waitress brought her coffee. She smiled, thanked her, and thought of the girl she once was, the one who served wine and never looked men in the eye. Now she stared at the horizon unflinching. A man sat down across from her without asking. Older, gray-suited eyes, kind. He said, Miss Costa, the families will come for you eventually. She said, let them. He smiled, said, they'll offer you a seat at the table. She said, I already have one. He asked, doing what she said, making sure no one else like him ever has to die alone. The man nodded, stood, left her with the sound of waves against stone, the city behind her, already forgetting the war, the legend of the fearless waitress who stood up to the Mafia boss and lived to tell it, fading into rumor. She finished her coffee, left a folded napkin on the table with 2 words written in ink still standing, and somewhere far beyond the harbor in a quiet grave by the cliffs, the wind carried the sound of laughter, low and warm like a promise kept. Years passed like waves carving the same shore again, and again the city changed, new faces, new kings, same ghosts. Eva Costa lived quietly on the edge of Palermo, her small apartment above a bakery filled with the smell of bread and sea air. She never told anyone who she used to be. Sometimes she would hear laughter from the street that reminded her of him, the low sound like gravel and thunder, and she would smile too. herself then go back to her work. She was older now, sharper, the kind of woman who could see danger before it spoke. Every morning she walked to the harbor, coffee in hand. The fishermen knew her name. They called her La Señora del Vento, the Lady of the Wind, because she always stood facing the storm, never turning away. At night she wrote letters she never sent to a man buried by the cliffs. She wrote about the world he left behind, about how the men who once ruled it had turned to dust, about how fear had new names but the same smell. She wrote about how she still saw his face in dreams, sometimes not as a ghost but as a man who finally found peace. One evening as the sun slipped behind the horizon, she found an envelope under her door, plain unmarked. She turned it over twice before opening. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged yellow but clean. At the bottom of the page a signature she thought she'd never see again. Dominic Vale. The handwriting unmistakable. The letter said, "If you're reading this, it means I lost, but it also means you won. You were never meant to be part of my world, but you walked into it and survived. That makes you stronger than every man I ever commanded. I left something for you, something that was never mine to keep. Go to the house by the cliffs, open the safe behind the piano. Remember the code is the day we met." Her hands trembled. The day we met. 3 numbers burned into her mind. She took the first train out of the city. The road to the cliffs looked the same, the sea crashing below, endless and cold. The house stood in ruins, its roof half gone, its windows broken, vines crawling across its bones. She stepped inside, the air thick with dust, the piano still there untouched. She brushed her fingers across the keys, the sound hollow but alive behind it. She found the safe, rusted but intact. She turned the dial. 129. The day of the storm, the day she shattered the glass that started everything. The lock clicked open. Inside she found a small leather box tied with a ribbon. She opened it and found a ring, heavy gold engraved with a crest. She recognized the family symbol, a lion clutching a rose, and beneath it a letter folded many times over. She unfolded it slowly, the words written in the same hand. "I built my empire on fear, but you showed me something stronger. You showed me mercy. Mercy is what makes us human, what the powerful always forget. I can't erase what I've done, but if you can forgive me, then maybe there's hope for men like me. Maybe there's hope for the world." There was one more line, faint, almost an afterthought. "I love you, not for saving my life, but for reminding me it was worth saving." Tears came quietly, not loud, not broken, just steady. She placed the letter back inside the box, closed the safe, and sat at the piano, the sun breaking through the clouds, spilling gold across the cracked floor. She pressed a single key, the sound drifting out the window into the wind. That night she lit a candle by the sea, the same spot where she buried him, the waves gentle. "Now," she said, "I kept your secret, I burned the rest. No one will know your sins, no one will know your name, but I will remember the man who learned to be good too late." And she smiled, the kind of smile that hurts because it's true. Years later children would tell stories about her. They said she was once a waitress who faced the mafia and lived. They said she carried the ring of a king and kept it hidden. They said she talked to the sea and the sea answered. One boy once asked her if the stories were real. She said, "The rest are dreams." Then she winked and said, "But dreams are where truth hides." And when she died they found the ring on her table beside a napkin folded perfectly in half. On it were 2 words written in faded ink, "Mercy wins." The wind carried her ashes over the cliffs where the sea waited like an old friend. Somewhere deep beneath the waves a lion carved in gold slept forever beside her, and the legend of the fearless waitress who stood up to the mafia boss became something more than a story. It became a memory that refused to fade, because some battles are not fought with guns or power, but with the courage to say no and the grace to forgive what the world says cannot be forgiven. And as long as the sea keeps its voice, her story will never end. Thank you for following this powerful story of courage, love, and redemption. If Eva's journey touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the smallest act of bravery can change everything.